Hello, and welcome to Bracewell's Data Center Counsel podcast. From energy and utilities to siting and financing, our attorneys cover the opportunities and issues with data center development.
Hello, everybody. This is Jared Berg back with you with another episode of the Data Center Counsel podcast. Really happy to have you guys here with us again. And today I have Bryan Clark with me again and Josh Robichaud from our power regulatory group out of DC. I'm Jared Berg. I'm a partner in our corporate and energy projects practice. Really excited to have you guys here again. Bryan and Josh, if you don't mind, Josh, why don't we start with you if you don't mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I am Josh Robichaud. I'm an associate in Bracewell's DC office. My practice focuses on power regulatory issues, everything from transmission, compliance, market-based rates, and as of late, more and more data centers.
I'm Bryan Clark from Bracewell's Dallas office. I am the partner in the energy practice group.
Awesome, guys. Well, excited to have you here with us again, Bryan and Josh, for the first time. I promise we'll take it easy on you here today, but today we are going to be talking about the overlay of the FERC and how federal regulatory considerations play into account for data center development, what we're seeing generally from a regulatory standpoint, and how that interplays with the state level regulatory considerations, both with, ERCOT versus PJM versus MISO, et cetera. So Josh here is one of our federal regulatory experts. He's all about the FERC. And so Josh, maybe you can tell us, I understand the FERC kind of sits on top of the states, the RTOs and ISOs, but then there's ERCOT, which is kind of sitting out there separately. ERCOT isn't necessarily regulated under the jurisdiction of the FERC, but it is still subject to some federal regulations. Like if you're going to build a generation facility in ERCOT, you still are going and selling into the wholesale market. You still want to register as an exempt wholesale generator in certain circumstances, stuff like that. But aside from that, tell us a little bit, like, where does FERC come into play? Where does their jurisdiction sit? Like, what are they covering versus what are the states covering? And it sounds like some of that is maybe being blended a little bit with recent developments. So maybe we can start there.
Sure. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has jurisdiction over wholesale sales in interstate commerce. In legal jargon, that means for a wholesale sale, that is a sale for resale. So not to the end user, not to the sort of wire running into your house, but instead the sale to a utility or something like that then carries that on through the distribution lines to your house. So they are focused on the broader transmission system, the higher voltage piece of the system, and making sure that the power delivered through that process is reliable and the sales are made at just and reasonable rates. So as you mentioned, that is largely organized through a series of RTOs and ISOs, regional transmission organizations or independent system operators. And those are entities that sit above the individual utilities that own the lines. They have, the utilities that own the lines have turned over operational control to these RTOs and ISOs. And those RTOs and ISOs are responsible for operating that system, planning the development and expansion of that system in coordination with the entities that own the lines themselves, the individual utilities, and making sure that depending on the market, depending on its structure, that there's enough generation resources on the system to serve demand. So they have a reliability aspect to their responsibility as well as that transmission planning. And that's where the sort of confluence of those two becomes particularly interesting and sometimes particularly thorny for data centers and these large loads, which have both their size and the pace of their development has bumped up against what has been the procedures that FERC has overseen and the individual RTOs and ISOs have implemented.
Got it. So maybe that's why ERCOT effectively is, people would say, not subject to FERC regulations because effectively they're their own territory. It's one state, not necessarily crossing over with other states, although I know that there's some exceptions to that.
Yeah, so ERCOT has specifically designed itself to be isolated in that way, commerce sales, and therefore placing itself outside of the jurisdiction of FERC for the purposes of the regulation of sales, market-based rates, things like that. But as you mentioned before, EWG or exempt wholesale generator, that is a different statute, the Public Utility Holding Companies Act, that FERC administers, but is overarching and still touches facilities that are located in Texas, in ERCOT more specifically.
Got it. So, and this is why we have experts like you at the firm, because I'm just a dumb corporate lawyer. Put commercial terms in front of me and I can figure it out. But that's why we bring in the real experts to make sure everything is in compliance. So in any event, sounds like there have been some updates, some developments. Of course, everybody is talking about data centers and the immense amount of load that the influx of data centers into the system. And I refer to the system generally, obviously there are these separate RTOs and ISOs, but where does the FERC's jurisdiction kind of start and end when you're talking about sales and interstate commerce? When you're trying to interconnect a large load, does the FERC really have jurisdiction over that? Is that more of a state level thing, more of an ISO RTO level thing? How does that work?
So interconnections to the transmission system would be administered by the RTO and ISO, and those procedures would be first proposed to and approved by FERC and applied to different facilities that want to interconnect. And again, that would be for the generation side of things, generation interconnection. FERC has not claimed jurisdiction over load. That has been traditionally the jurisdiction of states. And in addition to that, the distribution system has been the jurisdiction of states. So the line there is really drawn at the handover from the high voltage transmission system to the lower distribution voltage, and then split on the generator side. In terms of the interconnection piece of that, FERC and the RTOs and ISOs are involved in administering and overseeing that process. But the siting of generation, the siting of load, that is fully within the state's jurisdiction.
It sounds like we were talking a little bit before recording here. It sounds like there's new litigation that's going on, at least in New York, and then maybe other challenges that are being, challenges against new load interconnection procedures that are being proposed. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about, kind of the confusion, or is it confusion? What's going on?
So we'll take our time machine back just a little bit to 2002, and in just before that, FERC had implemented Order Number 888, which laid out the open access transmission principles that they were looking to implement as much as they could across the nation. And those open access transmission principles were the idea that the transmission system should be open and available to all people who are looking to use that, generators looking to move their power, and they should be able to access that system and be able to get service on that system on non-discriminatory terms. Up until that point, systems were operated by the local utility, and there was not exactly an easy way of interoperability to be able to move power long distances. So the idea was we will sort of integrate these systems into a broader interconnected web. That's where you have the development of RTOs and ISOs come out of. But as many of reforms are, that was challenged in court, and that ended up percolating all the way up to the Supreme Court in the case of New York versus FERC. And in that case, the Supreme Court upheld FERC's authority to require open access transmission and upheld FERC's decision to exercise jurisdiction over only unbundled retail transmission sales, and FERC's decision to decline to assert jurisdiction over bundled retail sales. Now, unbundled and bundled there, it's a term of art, but unbundled being the sale of the transmission service as separate from the generation. So sort of the two different line items on your bill. Whereas bundled is when those two pieces are sold together. When they were separated, there was a reasonable hook for FERC to get into the transmission piece of that, and they could assert jurisdiction over the unbundled transmission portion, which got them to regulating that. But they declined to assert jurisdiction over the bundled side, largely as a sort of deference to states that had traditionally been the state's jurisdiction, and just as a practical matter to make it administrable. So there were different parties that came up in the case arguing that FERC, on one hand, went too far, others arguing that FERC did not go far enough and should have asserted jurisdiction under those bundled sales. I mention all of this because there's a dissent in that case from Justice Clarence Thomas, where he disagreed with the majority's finding of sort of deferring to FERC's discretion, and stated that while Congress understood that transmission is a necessary component of all energy sales, it granted FERC jurisdiction over all interstate transmission without qualification. So his position was, sure, you may have may have exercised your discretion not to reach all the way down into these bundled retail sales to touch this portion that has traditionally been the jurisdiction of states, but the Congress did not lay it out that way, and you're required to do so. As I mentioned, that's a dissent. That was not the ultimate finding of the court, but I bring it up because it's that dissent and that idea is what is being cited in a lot of the reforms and changes that we've seen percolating up over the last year.
So basically, if I'm understanding this right, and just to boil it down for my dumb corporate brain here, the FERC has jurisdiction. Basically, well, Justice Clarence Thomas would say the FERC has jurisdiction all the way down to the distribution level, and arguably in that context has jurisdiction over large load interconnections, just for purposes of our discussion as well. But they've declined to assert their jurisdiction all the way down that level, and instead are basically stopping it at if you're just dealing with transmission and not dealing with the retail sale, then FERC will assert its jurisdiction to that level. But if you have a bundled transmission plus distribution sale, that is a separate kind of jurisdiction that FERC could assert, but is left to the states as of now.
Correct. And that's sort of where things landed on the other side of New York versus FERC, and is now being brought back to the forefront and questioned, if you will, in some of the justifications for jurisdiction that have been explained and outlined by various parties.
You mentioned, that there are some reforms that are being proposed. Maybe we can dive into that a little bit. And again, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about on this podcast is if you are a large load, if you have a data center, for example, or a large manufacturing facility that you're trying to interconnect to the grid in one of these states, you are facing long interconnection times. But as you mentioned, Josh, long interconnection, and maybe this was before we started recording, but long interconnection times have been a problem for years on the generation side, but it's now kind of a different, more acute issue, or maybe not more acute, but a different acute issue on the large load interconnection side. So what are some of these reforms that you're seeing that are being proposed?
So I'd put them in two main buckets. But as you mentioned, the generation interconnection process, particularly in PJM, has had a significant backlog in the last couple of years, really going on a decade, just due to the large amount of renewables and other small facilities looking to join the network and join the grid. Just the amount and scale of, even though they may be small projects, there's a large number of them. And that has sort of gummed up the works in terms of being able to secure interconnection and complete the interconnection process quickly. That's something that FERC has known and has proposed various reforms over the last couple of years to address. But when we got to data centers here and the sort of political and policy imperatives that came along with being able to scale AI development and data center development quickly, it presented a very unique and very specific pain point, and that has drawn a lot of attention from presidential administrations and states to address that and try to capture what they see as the opportunity of having these data centers built out and the transmission and other network upgrades associated with that. So it was percolating through FERC and others for about since late 2024, at least, when they held their first technical conference on this point. But last year, the Department of Energy sort of forced FERC's hand and issued a directive pursuant to the DOE's authority under Section 403, where they can basically propose a reform, a specific package of things that they would like to see FERC take on. Just in terms of background there, FERC is an independent agency. It functions sort of separately from the rest, but it is nonetheless underneath the DOE. So the DOE still has the authority to make these directions, even though FERC operates independently of that. But point being that DOE sort of pulled together this proposal. It's called an Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or ANOPR, that outlined some reforms that the DOE thought was appropriate. It is not a very detailed or specific in terms of implementation and practical specifics, but it nonetheless laid out 14 principles that it wanted FERC to consider and to issue a final rule on with a deadline of April 30th, 2026.
And so what was that like? What were those kind of points that the DOE, and I love the acronym soup here, FERC, DOE, ANOPR, that's a new one for me. So when you say that the DOE's kind of directive was somewhat broad and was highlighting 14 kind of points, what were kind of the biggest points there that they're trying to get after that they want the FERC to address?
They wanted to standardize the interconnection process for these large loads, and that included setting sort of standard study deposits and financial commitments that needed to be made by those who were looking to interconnect, as well as standardizing the process of how they were studied. That if you have a entity that is, say, a data center that needs 100 megawatts of power and a generating facility that is going to be able to connect sort of co-located directly to that, if the data center was going to consume that same 100 megawatts that the generator could provide, that doesn't have the same impact on the transmission grid as if it could only provide 80 megawatts of their 100, and that data center was still going to need to draw the remaining balance of that from the grid. So it was setting out some principles for how data center, particularly co-located large loads, should be studied so that the realities of how they were, or at least as the data centers were seeing it, the realities of how they were operating better aligned with the ways in which they were being studied on the larger grid and the costs that they were being assigned associated with the network upgrades or other things that were needed to accommodate them on the grid.
So basically, the directive is saying, hey, these data centers recognize that it's going to take a while to get interconnected if they are just solely relying on the grid. But if they bring their own generation with them, it should allow for a faster or an expedited process. Is that kind of what you're saying there?
Exactly. So if they're bringing in whole or in part the generation that they would need to do to be able to build out their data center, they should be able to still fit within this process. And as you're indicating, move through it more quickly than they would be if they were sort of standing at the back of the line with everyone else.
Interesting.
And some of the thorny issues that came up in this is, okay, you say data center, you say large load. How large is large load? They have, in this ANOPR, proposed 20 megawatts. Wow. So basically, if you were larger than 20 megawatts, then that would be, these new procedures would apply to you. But some of the commenters pointed out that's actually not large enough, that there are some industrial loads or other things like that that could fit within this 20 megawatt threshold that are not the type of thing that you're talking about. Some proposed thresholds in 100 megawatts, some higher than that, as more appropriate for if you're going to have this different and parallel system, that's the group that it should apply to. But you get into a lot of thorny issues there of who's being served by what threshold at what time.
Yeah, which is interesting because if you compare to ERCOT and Senate Bill 6, which we've talked about on previous episodes, but Bryan, Senate Bill 6 kind of designates 75 megawatts as kind of the threshold for large loads, right? But they also reserved the ability to change that threshold. Now, I don't recall, was the indication that threshold may go down, or was it more likely that it would go higher?
If they're going to change the threshold will go lower. But at this point in time, it's still 75 megawatts as outlined in the legislation.
Got it. Well, Josh, what is the FERC doing with this DOE directive?
So they quickly thereafter issued the ANOPR itself sort of through their official channels to receive feedback from stakeholders. That feedback, the first wave came in right around Thanksgiving of last year, and then reply comments in the middle of December. Everything we just talked about here in terms of size, the jurisdictional questions, all of that was raised by commenters, and 200 stakeholder comments is a significant amount, as you might imagine, for them to work through. So the next step in the process in terms of administrative procedure would be for FERC to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking. That would again be subject to the same notice and comment procedures, and then that would be followed by a final rule. And again, FERC has directed by the DOE to issue that final rule by April 30th, 2026. I should note that while that is sort of the deadline for FERC action, it is not necessarily a foregone conclusion that they will adopt these proposed reforms either in the form that they were proposed or at all. Back in 2017, the DOE did something similar, provided some reforms that they wanted to see FERC implement. And after going through this process, FERC said, we don't believe we have the authority to do what you are asking us to do. Therefore, we're going to close this out. And that satisfies the requirements of Section 403, but is obviously not the outcome that the DOE was looking for at that point. Here, it's still to be seen, what final form that it will take. Given the large amount of interest, we would expect to see a little bit more detail in the NOPR, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, of how these principles, the broader principles that the DOE laid out, are proposed to be implemented specifically.
So I guess so that I understand kind of where we are in the process and what's to come. So it sounds like the proposed rules haven't necessarily been fleshed out and finalized. So right now it's just the FERC is requesting comment on these 14 principles and how they may be implemented.
Yes. So they received those first 2 rounds of comments and presumably right now are in the process of pulling together that Notice of Proposed Rulemaking to then have another round of the same.
What are some of the things that are being speculated or some of the things that you're hearing about? Is there a risk that maybe the FERC is going to try and go farther than they potentially have the authority to do? Although we also talked about earlier, Justice Thomas's dissent maybe suggesting that the FERC can go all the way down to the distribution level and kind of take some more authority over the large load interconnection process. I mean, what are some of the reforms that we should be expecting that would come out of this rulemaking process? And curious if any of them kind of sound or ring similar to what we're seeing in ERCOT in particular.
In terms of the jurisdictional question, I think that's something that, to the extent FERC is going to take this on, is going to spill quite a bit of ink laying out what the justification is, because at the end of the day, they issue that final rule that is subject to challenge, first rehearing before the commission, and then can ultimately be appealed to the federal courts. So they need to have a strong justification in there. So I imagine that's something that they would be spending a significant amount of time on. But beyond that, laying out sort of the rules of the road, that if we are going to create this sort of parallel interconnection process for the large loads, having a good understanding, not least of which the size threshold, but what the eligibility criteria will be for being able to take advantage of that, as well as what type of study deposits and the various pieces that you will need to step through in order to make sure that the process is operating in a just and reasonable way parallel to the existing system. And we have some flashes of that in actions that they've taken back in December of this year, specifically in PJM. But I just pause there in case Brian has any thoughts on what we might see, or at least parallel to things that we've seen in Texas.
I think that in some ways, Texas would like to go its own way, but given the need for consistency within the industry, I think both FERC and Texas are essentially running these processes in parallel, but at the same time, looking to the best ideas from both. I guess that's my way of looking at it, simply because the industry wants standards, and just because Texas has its own grid through ERCOT doesn't necessarily mean that the standards have to be radically different.
And I would assume that all of these things are also going to address affordability concerns. I mean, one of the things that we saw last week, and today we're recording on January 22nd, but last week was the governor's meeting, governors from PJM meeting in the White House talking about affordability issues. Obviously, one of the things that we've talked about in previous episodes as well is how rate making occurs to some extent and how costs are effectively socialized when you have grid upgrades that need to be made. And so I guess is one of the things, I know one of the things that is addressed in the in Senate Bill 6 is cost allocation for grid upgrades that are attributable to large load interconnections. Are we seeing similar kind of chirping at the federal level, at the FERC level, Josh?
Yes, that was one of the other principles included in the ANOPR, was that idea of the cost allocation should be borne primarily by the data centers to the extent that they are relying on the transmission grid to serve their facilities. But we've also seen rumblings from some of the commissioners about sort of minimum charges or sort of baseline payments to make sure that these data centers, to the extent that they're making these investments and developments now, but to the extent that there's concerns that they may not be around forever to be able to fully pay off those costs or fully recover the costs associated with building this out, that there's some assurance provided up front to the rest of the ratepayers so that they're not stuck holding the bag.
Yeah, basically, if you sign up for an interconnection and then you never build your data center or your other large load facility, who pays for the upgrade costs that were installed, right?
Right.
Yeah. difficult issue.
Well, I guess a question I had along that line is, does FERC necessarily want to dictate a set amount to the RTO and ISOs, or are they looking more along the lines of prescriptive measures saying that the parties requesting for an interconnection request should share in the cost, something that's more subjective based upon the conditions of what the potential large load is requesting?
I think they have an interest in setting some clear rules, maybe minimizing subjectivity in terms of what the specific allocation would be. Maybe not going all the way to a specific set amount, but whether it be formulaic or something like that, having consistency across the RTOs and ISOs, because I think they also have an interest, while they acknowledge that there are reasonable justifications for having deviations across regions and things like that, want to set up a system so that we don't end up with a glut of data center development or something like that in a particular region just because it's easier to move through or more permissive in one way or another. Again, they acknowledge that there can be differences across them, but this may be an area where having more standardization would be to their benefit.
And would it be along the lines of making an upfront payment, such as a contribution in aid of construction, or would it that simply becomes a sunk cost for the party requesting the load? Or is it going to be something along the lines of financial guarantees until you achieve energization, and then those costs are rolled in the rate base?
We've seen a mix of all of those in the more recent stuff through PJM, falling more on the side of the sort of security deposits and upfront payments, so that is in place. But it's just one region and one area where they've proposed those reforms, either through the ANOPR or something like that. Maybe we see something more broad-based that allows for a greater level of flexibility.
Because a lot of what you're starting to see is a significant amount of public pushback through community-based organizations, things like that, specifically against data centers. But you may also see it with other large loads being connected, that a lot people are claiming rightly that energy costs are going up. But I mean, as we all know, and many of our listeners know, I mean, energy costs writ large just isn't the commodity. It's also the transmission costs, the distribution costs that are part of the overall bill of getting electricity to an end use customer. So do you think that once these proposals start working through, that if it turns into essentially cost recovery into rate base, that really doesn't do anything for the public, because those costs are socialized across the system? Yes, the large load interconnect ends up paying some of it because it's a socialized cost, but your commodity price may stay static, but your transmission fees, your distribution fees may be going up because of these costs being socialized.
I think that's a central and thorny piece of this that is less appreciated in terms of the transmission side of things, because there'll be a necessary level of build out to accommodate this. I think that's where the arguments around the co-location, and if they're able to provide the full amount that they need, maybe there's less of an impact there, but it's still not going to be zero. And simply put, I agree. I think it's going to be a tough needle to thread.
Right. But I mean, at the same point, I mean, it determines a lot, like you hit upon, are we going to be co-locating, or are we just going to be building these large load customers without any generation associated with them? And I mean, at what point and I know this is a rhetorical question, but at what point do the policymakers decide that it's going to be these large load customers that are going to pay the bulk of these fees to avoid these socialized costs and things like that? But at the same time, if you push too much of the costs onto the large load, they may want to go elsewhere. They may want to go to a different location that maybe just has more of an amorphous, you'll share in the costs, that appears to be what's happening in Texas, or may potentially go overseas. There is that option.
Yeah, after a certain point, if you push too much cost to the developers, to the ones who are trying to build these facilities, then it no longer becomes economic to do so.
Right.
Josh, maybe to wrap things up a little bit, you were alluding earlier to maybe some recent events, recent developments between FERC and PJM in particular. And we were talking before the recording about how there was a lawsuit between Constellation and PJM Interconnection. And, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what was going on there, because it does hit on kind of the co-location point and projects, facilities that are trying to build with co-located generation and then, potentially running up against some issues.
So Constellation had filed a complaint at FERC alleging that their interconnection procedures specifically for co-located load were unjust and unreasonable. And that's a legal term of art in the FERC world. But basically that it was not properly accounting for the unique attributes of co-located projects and preventing their ability to interconnect and participate in the market. FERC ultimately denied that complaint, but acknowledged that there was uncertainty there and opened up some proceedings gathering feedback on that point. And that ultimately culminated in a show cause order past December, where FERC came out and found that the PJM tariff as currently outlined was unjust and unreasonable and needed to be changed. And as part of that, proposed a handful of reforms that they saw as addressing at least some of those concerns. To be clear, this Constellation proceeding was one of several that were consolidated as part of this issuance last December, but they were all touching on this data center co-located load need for both expedited interconnection and more clear procedures for how to go about it. The main headline that came out of that was FERC directed PJM to implement 3 new types of transmission service: a firm contract demand service that would allow customers to have the same reservation and curtailment priority as existing firm transmission services, but would not allow them to withdraw energy from the transmission system beyond their contract demand amount. So that's, again, sort of matching your total demand as the data center to the generation that you're able to bring with you. A second service of non-firm contract demand service. So that would allow a customer to withdraw energy from the transmission system when the transmission capability was available, but not needed by firm customers. So this is sort of a conditional, you can have up to this amount when that's available on the grid. And that is, at least that flexibility is one of the things that the data center developers were looking for, so that they weren't locked out entirely, just as long as they were willing to accept that sort of conditional piece of the service. And then finally, an interim non-firm service for network customers. So that would allow the customer to receive non-firm service until all the transmission network upgrades necessary to provide their network interconnection service are complete. So that's sort of bridging the gap of an interim level of service. We know that you're building your system out. It may be in multiple phases, but you're able to get up to a certain level while these upgrades are going on, and then once they're complete, pick up the rest. So it was trying to solve some of the sort of interconnection backlog and expedite the total process by providing these new types of interconnection service that would be available to specifically serve data centers and large loads.
Got it. And I guess part of the issue then is when you interconnect to the grid, you assume, as of today, you are getting firm service, right? When you interconnect at a certain level, you're supposed to get that amount of electricity. And effectively what this is saying is, okay, well, we can give you certain options, and maybe one option that allows more flexibility on the utilities side of things allows for a faster interconnection timeline, it sounds like.
In this specific data center context, yes, there's a variety of transmission services available outside of this, and these ones were specifically designed and tailored to serve the needs of data centers and large loads in this sort of transition period.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Just that process is ongoing. PJM still needs to file the tariff revisions to implement what was directed by FERC there. But it's sort of the first operationalization of these reforms that we've seen, specifically directed in PJM, being Virginia, state of Virginia is included in PJM, and that's one of the hotspots of data center development. So in that way, it's addressing it, but we could see reforms like this in other RTOs and ISOs. It remains to be seen if they will take that on themselves or if FERC will direct them to do so. But this is specifically just in PJM at this point.
Got it. So if I could summarize, basically what we're seeing from the FERC right now is just a lot of activity, all intending to address kind of the thorny issues that we talked about today and we talked about on other episodes, which is how do you deal with the increasing costs, not necessarily directly attributable to data centers, but to the extent that, new large loads are going to be integrated into the grid, maybe shifting some of the upgrade costs that are necessary to support that load growth over to the new large loads that are connecting, while at the same time allowing for more flexibility in the system in order to allow for faster interconnection times. And maybe all of that is also driving towards, if you bring your own generation to some extent, that might also speed up the process because you can, potentially take advantage of an expedited process in that respect as well.
Yes, and that's, we have the PJM process that we just talked about. That's separate and distinct from the ANOPR and the FERC 403, or excuse me, the DOE Section 403 process. So just to point out that FERC has a lot of irons in the fire right now in terms of how they're going to address this. It's still an evolving sort of policy and overall structure that they're trying to lay out, but they're trying to be responsive at least to the political directions that they're getting, as well as I mentioned, those stakeholder comments and things to sort of, while the plane is flying or ship is sailing, add this piece to meet the needs of data centers and large loads.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this. It sounds like we've got some more updates that will be coming from the FERC perspective. Maybe we can do another episode on this once those final rules come out and that ANOPR procedure is complete. But really appreciate your time today, Josh. Bryan, thanks again for joining us again. This has been another episode of the Data Center Counsel podcast. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Bracewell's Data Center Counsel podcast. To contact any of today's guests, please reach out to datacentercounsel@bracewell.com.